Dear students, I hope you were able to understand the process of pollination which we had discussed in the previous video. Now we are moving a step ahead to understand what are the types of pollination, how they are brought about. So in this, we are going to study first the pollination which is brought about with the help of wind, that is known as anemophily. Now, when we talk of pollination, pollination can be broadly classified depending upon what factors are involved. It is divided into two types, that is abiotic factors, abiotic method, or the biotic factors. Now, when we talk of the pollination which is brought about by abiotic factors, that involves all the non-living things, that is air and water are the major medium by which the pollination is brought about. When we talk of the abiotic factors will involve the use of insects or the bats or the animals or snails, etc., for the transfer of the pollen grains to the stigma of the flower for effective fertilization. Now, when we observe, we find that in the nature, mostly the pollination in the plants is brought about with the help of biotic factors. Very few species, or compared to the species, total number of species, few members or few plants only go for water and wind pollination. So let us study about first the process of pollination by wind, that is known as anemophily. When we talk of anemophily, anemophily is mostly seen in gymnosperms. It is observed in gymnosperms. Now, when the pollination is to be done, the pollen grains and the stigma interaction is very, very important. So, the pollen grains which needs to be carried from the male flower to the female flower have to undergo certain kind of modifications, and these are known as the adaptations. So the wind pollinated plants have undergone slight modification so as to bring about effective fertilization. So we see normally that the pollen grains which are found in wind pollinated flowers are light and non-sticky, so that they can be light in weight, so that they can be carried far and wide with the help of the wind current. And these are also non-sticky, which this property, that is the pollen grains being light and they are non-sticky, this enables the pollen grains to be carried far and wide. The second important adaptation is the stamens are well exposed. Stamens need to be well exposed. Stamens are the male reproductive part carrying the anther, that is having the pollen grains. So the stamens are well exposed. As a result, they can be, when the dehiscence of the anther take place, the pollen grains can be easily carried by the wind to different places for fertilization. The stigma is large and feathery to trap the pollen grains. Now, when the pollen grains are carried by the wind, the stigma must be suitably exposed. It should be large enough to accept the pollen grains, and the feathery nature of the stigma helps in trapping the pollen grains as they move along with the current. Now, the anemophily, that is the plants that follow this or which observe this kind of pollination, they may be unisexual or bisexual. Now, in case of unisexual flowers, the male flowers are more than the female flowers. For the obvious reason, because in case of unisexual flower, that means a plant will be either male or female. So, the pollen grains need to be carried from one plant to the other plant, and for that they need to have a more number of pollen grains produced, because during the carrying by wind many of the pollen grains may be lost. So to prevent that, or to compensate for the loss, the male flowers are more than the female flowers. Then flowers in this case, that means the anemophilic or anemophilous plants, the flowers are small, inconspicuous, that means they are not very clearly and brightly colored. That is, they are colorless and nectarless. These flowers actually are colorless and nectarless because the color and the nectar, they are responsible for attracting the insects to bring about the pollination. But here there is no need for the plants to be colorful and having rich nectar. So therefore these plants are colorless normally, and they are nectarless as well, and they are small and inconspicuous. Also, the flowers, but that is both the male and the female flowers, are packed into inflorescence. That means they are packed closely and they appear as inflorescence so as to bring about the pollination effectively, because large number of pollen grains will land upon the stigma which is occurring as a inflorescence, because note down, the flowers are small, so they are grouped together in inflorescence so as to trap the pollen grains. The examples of this is maize. Grasses are very good example. Wheat, rice, ray, etc. There are many examples which follow the pollination process by wind. Now let us take example of corn. That is the maize. That follows the anemophilous method of pollination. Now as you can see over here, the plant is slender. This is the leaf sheath. This is the sheath over here. Now this plant has both male and female reproductive parts. So the tassel over here is the male flower that is having a group over here, as you can see the structure over here, and this is the female part. This female is well protected, the female reproductive part, that is well protected with the help of a structure which is leafy like, and it is known as the ear. And on the top you must have seen on the corn the golden hair, that is known as the silk. Now actually what happens is, when the pollen grains mature, that means when the tassel carrying the pollen grains mature, they rupture, releasing the pollen grains, and these pollen grains are trapped by the silk, which is feathery and in large number. So this brings about the pollination, and as a result of the pollination we find the kernel, that is the cob kernel, and if there is no pollination over there, that place or that ovule will not, egg will not fertilize and will have a blank over there. So the tassel over here in the case of corn or maize is the male flower. This is the tassel internode, that is the gap between the leaf over here at the top, and this corn is representing the silk. The golden hair represents the silk, and the ear, which is a female flower. So the number of pollen grains which are being released over here are carried by wind, and they are trapped by the silk over here, which eventually helps in the fertilization process. As you can see in this, the another modification is the male flower is situated on the top and the female is situated at the lower side. This is because this will facilitate the landing up of pollen grains onto the silk or the female flower. So what happens is, this wind blowing on maturation of the pollen grains will, after the dehiscence, they are released, carried by the wind, and they are trapped by the silk. So as a result, it brings about the pollination. Also, it is important in these plants that the maturation of the pollen grain and the formation of the egg is synchronized. That means the timing is similar for both. So anemophilous plants are mostly gymnosperms. I hope you are able to understand. Thank you.